A thunderous crash from the far side of the garden, across the hedges. The old man shut the journal and put it in the inner pocket of his coat as he pushed himself up from the bench. Even with clockwork, there will be imperfections. All things require maintenance. As he walked, he produced a silver hand mirror from an outer pocket and glanced at the bobbing, distorted reflection of his rounded face, framed by flowing ivory locks and beard. If something was out of sync in the garden, no doubt there were greater imperfections still that had yet escaped his notice. Pyrus, hours before the apocalypse.
Welcome back to the Atnia In-Depth series, where we talk about a specific thing within Atnia, the world of our tabletop RPG and card game. I'm Ski, here with Kjavin, and today's episode will be about an individual who is rather integral to how the fallen kingdom of Atnia has become what it is in the present day, a dangerous land home to a variety of small societies who survived a magical apocalypse. And this individual is Pyrus.
Right, and it might be accurate to say that there would be no Atnia in the form it currently exists were it not for Pyrus. Prior to Pyrus and the other Archmages arriving at this major archaeological site, Atnia was more of a hypothetical than a real kingdom. It was known as the center of the old Alvan or Elvish empire that had once spanned the globe. But people don't really know a lot about it or how it was in that time, which is why such archaeological sites are important. But it was kind of assumed that whoever ended up controlling this sort of hypothetical kingdom of Atnia, like that's sort of the seat of power in the world itself. But at the time when the Archmages arrived, it was just sort of untamed jungle.
Yes, and the Archmages are a group of, I believe, 7 individuals who, previous to the current age, which is post-apocalypse, they kind of started the Age of the Archmages by... how much do we want to say about how they gained their power?
I think that's something that it can be kept kind of universe spoilers. All that we'll say is that the initial expedition, there were actually 5 of them at first, and 2 Archmages ended up joining their ranks over time. And they discovered the source of power of the Alva, or the elves, deep beneath the earth in the ruins at Hatton. And we can leave the rest of sort of what the nature of that power is a mystery for the time being.
But yes, safe to say it was quite powerful, and they were able to live for an extremely long time until this whole apocalypse happened, and they were essentially the rulers of the world during that time. So how long was that age?
Over like a couple hundred years. And so some notes is that they weren't necessarily the rulers of the world exactly, but they were integral in shaping it. So Pyrus is actually a great example of this, where he did not rule the country of Atnia. He was sort of a power behind the throne. He was the High Chancellor of Atnia behind the King and Queen, but he did a lot to really shape the nation and its laws throughout its course, and of course outlived multiple kings and queens of that country once it was founded.
Yeah, so the Archmages didn't always necessarily take the position of power within whatever form of government was in their region, but as the highest power, but they were always like their kind of they had a lot of power in other ways, like through their magic and general influence over the other rulers and region, that they were kind of able to be one of the most important figures in shaping their societies.
Yeah, exactly. And so as we're probably going to have videos highlighting each of these Archmages, so once those exist, they'll be linked here. But Pyrus, of course, each of these Archmages kind of had their own focuses and powers. Pyrus was particularly focused on law, mathematics, and language were kind of the scholarly areas of study and magics that he focused on.
So in post-apocalypse Atnia, a lot of people have different theories as to what may have caused the apocalypse, but many seem to blame the Archmages. Now, why might this be?
Yeah, so, well, for one, it's very clearly a magical apocalypse on some level. There's this great magical rift in the sky outpouring this energy, and the monsters that are created by this rift hunt down arcane energy. And in addition to that, the Archmages really brought magic back into the world when they explored the ruins of the Alva. Like, magical items and things like that were incredibly rare before the Archmages came back onto the scene and introduced schools where they taught people magic, and magic was brought back everywhere. So, it's a common belief that, like, essentially this magic was sort of a sin produced by humanity, and that excess ended up causing all of this harm is something that some people might say. And then also, these archmages were incredibly powerful, much more powerful than any other wizard. They had lived so long, for a couple hundred of years, and as they grew older, they grew more mistrustful of each other. And so there are these theories that essentially what happened was this very sudden magical war where they basically devastated each other's nations, and that was kind of responsible for the apocalypse. No one really knows whether that was the case, but there is like some evidence for this. For example, after the apocalypse, Pyrrhus's clock tower that he always stayed in Pax, is sort of his magical arcane tower, is frozen in time, shattered in half, as though there was some kind of attack and attempted a defense on it. But all of this is really just speculation. No one's ever been able to even reach Pax yet since the apocalypse, because of all of these. It's kind of a magically locked down city at the moment, so no one's entirely sure what happened.
Yeah, so we've mentioned a few times now that the Archmages are very powerful. So can you give us like a bit of the scale of like what are they known to be able to do? Let's say they're going up against an army. There's an army in the distance. Are they screwed, or is the army just kind of toast?
I think that depends contextually, right? So, like, these archmages have different amounts of power. I think, in particular, the archmage Ludikai, who's capable of performing a type of magic that he refers to as major alchemy, which is kind of like this intense, powerful physical magic, might be able to just take down an entire army in a flash by, like, conjuring up a storm or shooting a massive fireball. Pyrus, on the other hand, might not be able to do that without preparation, because his magic was a lot more focused on laws and sort of contingencies. However, if he knew an army was coming, he might well be able to handle an army long before they arrived, because a lot of what Pyrrhus's magic is involved in is in contracts and laws. So over the entire nation, with the help of his lieutenant sort of arbiter mages, he basically managed to enforce Atnia's laws that were passed by the assembly and the king and queen through magic, so that you would actually be magically punished or magically detected if you were to betray laws in most places in the country.
So did he have much influence over these laws through this process, or was he mostly just a person who's kind of a neutral figure enforcing such laws?
So technically Atnia is a constitutional monarchy, so there are certain elected positions, and there are also hereditary positions as part of the monarchy. And Pyrrhus was in one of those elected positions, so High Chancellor, but for the entire time that he was alive and the entire time of the country of Atnia, he was consistently elected to High Chancellor. And so he was a very influential writer on what the laws ought to be, and people kept electing him to kind of shape these. But there are also constraints based on the nature of the government and the fact that the monarch still does hold supreme power. So he had a lot of influence over what those laws could be, but he also still was sort of beholden to them and the rules of the nation in some important ways.
Yeah, so the different archmages kind of shaped their societies in different ways, and maybe in the future episodes we'll get into the different ways that they did that, but so Pyrrhus was kind of this, sort of politician or member of the king's court or something along those lines, and he was also very influential in creating how this government structure operates by having these laws, which is kind of one of his main things. Is he's all about the law magic and the rule of law, and having these magically enforced laws. It's like supposed to be a kind of, I guess, platonic ideal of the law, and that it truly does affect everyone in the same way, perhaps with some exceptions.
With kind of exceptions. That everyone has to obey the same laws, but people have different rights. I think it may be important, before we start this, to go back and give a little background on why Pyrrhus cares about these things the way he does. So the Archmages were, for the most part, students at a university in the Hellas Isles, which essentially they were all studying history and various things. And Pyrrhus was from the island of Advar, which was a republic, actually, not a kingdom, and it was a democratic republic with this really sort of lively political debate. But there were a lot of sort of like demagogues and things, and he kind of grew up. His parents were politicians, and he saw this as a society that he wanted to change. He wanted to alter the structures and had all of these theories for how to improve the laws in Advar. And one of the reasons that he specifically chose to study language and mathematics in addition to laws is that Hellas is basically it used to be a bunch of very independent islands that all spoke different languages. Stuff kind of changes there after the Archmages, and the Archmage Augusta is the one that kind of has influence over Hellas after all of this. But during the time that Pyrus was kind of coming up, having this ability to conduct diplomacy with others of these small island nations was really important, and so he was focusing on language and law and trying to learn these things in school. But then what happened is, well, he was delving into the Alvan ruins and coming into sort of his own in power. His island of Advar actually got basically torched to the ground by pirates. And so he had always planned on going back and dealing with politics there. But absent that, he just kind of remained near the ruins of Aton and helped to sort of establish that society using the ideas that he had about sort of legalism. But because there was already sort of a king and queen that he had agreed to work with in that area, he started thinking about how he could adapt his ideas to a mixed democracy with this monarchy technically in charge, but also sort of democratic systems to keep them in check. And that's sort of where you get his ultimate ideas. And so Atnia, everyone is equal under the law, but there also is a caste system where there's the gold caste, which are people who are directly related to the monarch. There's the silver caste of people who are of the various other sort of branches of nobility who don't have a direct blood relationship to the monarchy. And peasants can be raised up into the silver caste and then ultimately marry into the gold caste in theory. And then there's the bronze caste of peasants. And while they're all equal under the law and have the same rights, the higher castes have different sort of privileges on top of those rights.
Yeah, so this is kind of paints a picture of the kingdom as it existed before the apocalypse, and this is the Atnia that you would have known if you were there beforehand. But since the apocalypse, a lot of the magical laws have been sort of not working, and Pyrus is nowhere to be seen, correct? Have any of the Archmages been seen since the apocalypse?
Well, that's maybe, but you might not know that you've seen them, I guess, is a small thing. But no, Pyrus has not been seen since the apocalypse.
And I suppose another thing that I would like to ask is, the two previous episodes of this series that we've done have been on the Knights of Redemption, which is kind of a successor to the Atnian kingdom, as well as the Old Watch, which is sort of this peasant democracy. And we've mentioned a few other factions, such as the Fifth Legion, the Forsaken, and the Salt Alliance. So the Salt Alliance was a band of resistance fighters before the apocalypse. And I suppose my question here is, how did Pyrus relate to these different groups as they were before the apocalypse, and perhaps what would he maybe think of them now in the ruins of his kingdom?
That's a great question, and that's really complex. So prior to the apocalypse, most of these groups didn't exist in the form that they're in. So the Knights of Redemption were founded by Eudoxia, who, before becoming Queen Eudoxia, was Saint Eudoxia. She was a part of the church who had done great heroic deeds, but was also kind of threatening a schism in the church prior to the apocalypse. And Pyrus found it kind of an annoying thorn in his side that she was around, but she also was part of his nobility, and he wasn't going to do anything about her if he wasn't doing anything illegal. Ultimately, that was Servo, another Archmage's problem to deal with, because Servo is the one who's at the head of the church. So that's kind of how he would have felt about Eudoxia. I think he would be happy that the Knights of Redemption exist and are trying to restore order in Atnia at the end of the day, and yeah, I think that would probably be, of the major factions, the one he would most closely align with. Next, of course, is the Fifth Legion, which is still a successor to his army, also kind of viewing itself as a successor state. And again, he would probably be more allied with that, but I think he would like the sort of order and nobility focused on by the Knights of Redemption, whereas the Fifth Legion are a little bit scrappier and a little bit more fast and loose with the rules, which he would be less of a fan of.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I suppose we'll get into it next, which is the Old Watch, because that also has a very legalistic structure, but it's also a very different one than to the one that Pyrus had in the past. So how would you view this? Would you view this as a terrible thing that is happening and the peasants are all like making the rules or whatever? Or would he be like, yes, you guys are doing a cool legal structure here, you're obeying the rule of law, and I like that?
Yeah, I honestly think it might be kind of a coin flip based on how he approached the group. Of the Old Watch could be his favorite, or he could hate their guts, based on kind of like how he learned about them first. Because I think it would really call back to his younger years when he wanted to obviously like help fix the laws of an actual democratic republic, and he just kind of got landed with a kingdom and chose to help sort of implement that structure. And I think there's ways that he came to sort of appreciate the methods of control and organization that came with sort of a mixed democracy and with an objective authority of like a king and a queen to sort of keep the rabble in check. Because one of the problems that he had to deal with in his home island were these issues where like a demagogue would come up and politics would just sort of change on a dime, and he really didn't like that and wanted to find ways for politics to be sort of robust and have more of a balance of power. But the Old Watch does have a balance of power in its own ways, so I think his opinions on them could be very mixed. I could see them being his favorite, and I could also see him being very annoyed by them.
Yeah, that's a kind of a interesting answer. I suppose that's roughly what I would have expected, but yeah, interesting to hear. And the other two remaining factions, the Salt Alliance and the Forsaken, I'm guessing he would not be too fond of them.
No, absolutely not. I mean, he spent a lot of his life fighting with the Salt Alliance. This is kind of the one faction that was existed basically in its current form prior to the apocalypse, and they were always a sort of thorn in his side throughout their existence, trying to deny him various resources. Again, they're the Salt Alliance because initially some of their raids were trying to prevent enough salt from coming in to feed the Atnian military and other such things. And they just kind of existed in the mountains raiding his stuff. There, a lot of deserters from his armies were members of this organization, so he was always kind of trying to stamp them out to a certain extent, although there are ways in which he found them useful because obviously, like, if you're trying to keep a well-organized nation, like the threat of terrorists on your border can be a kind of useful political tool to say, hey, we need these more sort of like stricter laws right now because of the scary thing. So there are ways that he found them useful, but for the most part, he just absolutely hates them. And then the Forsaken are such an alien thing to when he lived in the world. Like, I don't think he would have anticipated this world where people are thinking the gods are dead or have abandoned us. And the idea that that happened, and then there are people who are like, oh, heck yeah, the gods have abandoned us, we're free now. I mean, he wouldn't like them, but it would be a whole bit of, like, I guess, temporal whiplash for him to show up and meet them.
I suppose that brings up the question of what Pyrus actually thought of the gods. Like, what were his relationship to them? The gods are also fairly powerful beings, one would presume, so was he still kind of beholden to the power of the gods, or did he like them and kind of worship the gods, or were they just kind of another kind of adversary, you might say?
It's a mix of things. So the Archmage Servo is the one who had the most control over the gods, or is in people's access to the gods, and he would use that power because he had sort of control over the Unitarian Church, the Veriglass, which exists in everyone's nations, to expand his influence. And when the Archmages kind of enter this sort of Cold War era, he has a lot of power, or Servo has a lot of power over the church, and that's something that Pyrrhus doesn't necessarily like. And so there are ways in which the gods are an obstacle to him, but like with every other brand of magic, all of the Archmages eventually started incorporating each other's powers and abilities, and so he worked with gods some himself, too. Just in his own way, and he was most closely aligned with Ulm, the god of the dead, and commerce, and also law, because Ulm is who judges you at the end of your life. So, and so that's kind of the god that he's closest to. But yeah, I think his perspective on the gods is somewhat mixed, as they are both a useful magical tool, but also they're representative of the power of another who he would often kind of work against in this sort of Cold War style standoff between the other Archmages.
If there ever was to be a full-on conflict between an Archmage and a god, I guess just to indulge myself and probably some of the people watching, who would win?
I think that really depends, and I guess to tease some secrets that might be uncovered in the universe later, that might have happened, and the results may have been a little inconclusive.
Interesting. So one thing I'm wondering while we're talking about this, the Salt Alliance is, did the Salt Alliance have any relations with the other Archmages, or did the other Archmages have similar sort of adversarial groups kind of attacking their kingdoms, or were they all even in kingdoms? Were they all even sort of politically inclined the way Pyrus seems to have been, or how are they doing? Are some of them just like these weird old wizards living in a tower and never talking to anyone, maybe?
Yeah, so we'll do a really quick survey, I guess, of the other Archmages and sort of the other major Archmage-impacted nations where they exist. So Servo is the Archmage that ends up at the head of the Veriglass, which is the Unitarian Church that kind of becomes the world church throughout. And basically, their mission is to convince everyone that, hey, you all think you've been worshipping different gods, but actually we've all been worshipping the same pantheon, and these are just different faces of the same gods. And thus to try, ultimately, one of their objectives is world peace, at recognizing that we don't need to war over religion anymore is kind of one of their hopeful ideals. And so Servo is the high pontiff of this church. He's not exactly the ruler of a nation, but this church kind of rules everything that's going on up through a large chunk of the north of the world. To Atnia's east is the nation of Lekvia, which is another kingdom. And the Archmage Sorvald is the high physician there. He's actually probably the least politically active of the Archmages, and he's just sort of the court physician of this nation. And while he does obviously do things to the benefit of his nation and is responsible for a lot of his nation's prosperity as being a master alchemist and physician, he doesn't appear, at least on the surface, to be as involved in politics as a lot of the other Archmages. To Atnia's west is the nation of Mnem, where Oana comes from. Oana was the teacher of all the original Archmages and the one who led the expedition to Atoll in the first place. And she returned to her homeland and ended up becoming the Queen of Mnem, which is becomes a sort of magocracy. It's the one that is actually quite literally ruled by magical power, with her being at the height of it. And that country did have serious resistance groups that are sort of tied to the Salt Alliance in some ways, because Mnem as a country has more ogres in it than some of the other places. And ultimately, Oana kind of instituted a sort of apartheid state where a lot of these ogres were enslaved and some other kind of horrible stuff. And that resistance ended up being connected to the Salt Alliance. The beginning of the Archmage's power kind of slipping, leading before the apocalypse, was actually these enslaved ogres overthrowing Oana's government, and they, nearing the apocalypse, were actually moving on Atnia alongside the Salt Alliance. So there was kind of some of that stuff going on. To Atnia's south is the nation of Jesbark, which is ruled by one of the youngest Archmage, Ludikai, who was actually just a young prince, an heir to the throne of this large nation. Technically, it wasn't a nation that was entirely controlled at the time, but that's a complicated thing. Basically, Ludikai ends up learning from the Archmages and then going into Atoll and gaining the same power that they got himself, much to some of their chagrin, as they were happy with him as a student, but not quite happy with him as an equal. But he ends up becoming emperor of this entire nation. And finally, as far as the nations go, Augusta ends up sort of uniting and keeping peace in Hellas. So after her friend's home island gets destroyed, she's a soldier. One of the Archmages who wasn't mainly kind of a student going in there, but was a soldier, a mercenary, kind of there to protect them. And she goes and really tries to deal with a pirate problem in Hellas, and ends up leading an armada and basically keeping peace between all the islands. And so the islands of Hellas are still kind of a federation of separated nations, but they are now sort of a united force under Admiral Augusta's sort of watchful eye, keeping them from warring with each other and keeping them sort of united to an extent. And then finally, there's the Archmage Nika, who never ends up with a nation in her own, but learns how to travel to other worlds and far-off places and kind of messes with illusion and stuff, and is sort of seen as maybe a kind of creepy, mysterious force by a lot of the other Archmages.
Other worlds, what exactly do you mean by that? Like other places within the sort of continent Atnia is on, or beyond that?
She appears to be able to open portals to other strange dimensions that have the other archmages haven't explored this nearly as much as her, but obviously there's in this world there's the world of Dream, but it seems she can also open portals to just other places in that don't exist on the physical plane, or at least this physical plane.
So perhaps she had access to similar powers as the Forsaken, but maybe more so?
Yeah. She could also, for example, open up portals to the Hells, potentially even, which Servo could also go and visit the land of the gods as well, but Nika could do that as well. So any sort of boundary between worlds, Nika had a lot of access to.
Interesting. Returning to Pyrus, since we've talked about the different archmages and their different magical powers a bit, what were the other kind of types of magic that Pyrus would normally use besides the ability to create these magical laws?
Yeah, so his bread and butter were laws and contracts. And the way that this would work is actually, so with contracts, a lot of what he's doing is he's a very politically kind of focused archmage, and he works on alliances between the nations. His view is that, especially as the archmages grew to mistrust each other more, is that the best thing to do is to create a web of alliances such that it would be disaster if anyone were to go to war with anyone else. And use this through magically enforced contracts. So he worked a lot on diplomacy between all the nations to kind of prevent a sort of a situation where the Cold War turns into an actual war. So in addition to these laws and sort of like binding contracts, he also did a lot of magic involving language. So like encoding thoughts or ideas in writing or and that kind of thing. He also did a lot of magic sort of involving math and geometry, which he viewed as inherently related to language. And so he would be working with sort of like logic or these sort of perfect structures. You mentioned actually Plato earlier, and that's sort of some of the inspiration for this character, where he often is thinking about sort of the Platonic form and structure of objects. And so his magic works a lot with kind of like clockwork and sort of systems where if you have one input, you get an expected output.
So that's kind of gone over the sort of broad strokes on who Pyrus is as a figure within the world, but maybe tell us a little bit about, I guess, a day in the life of Pyrus as a person. Like, what is he generally doing?
Okay, so say he wakes up one day, kind of in his magical clock tower near the palace at Pax, and first he has a lot of papers to sign and just basic paperwork to do as High Chancellor of this nation, essentially making sure laws get passed and fulfilling his duties. He may also write some philosophy, send letters to neighboring nations. He's also, among the archmages, the closest friend with his neighbor Sorvald, so some days they might meet at a neutral territory, either in Lekvia or in the town of Svet, which is kind of the closest place there, and play a game of chess or some such thing, and kind of discuss politics and the state of the world. And he would spend a lot of his time, he has this, around his clock tower, this hedge maze and garden that he keeps carefully curated. And he would, in general, just kind of spend a lot of time meditating on management of his nation, is really the thing that he came to see as his lifelong project. And the most important thing to him was this creation of a sort of perfect, well-structured society that exists in harmony with itself.
So you mentioned one of his friends is the other Archmage, Sorvald, and I guess who are the other like sort of people in his life? Like, what are his friends or family members? Who does he talk to?
Well, unfortunately, his whole family is dead. So his island got burned to the ground. It's actually him and Nika were both from the same island, and they lost basically everyone in that. For a long chunk of time, his closest friends were the other archmages, but a lot of them started to sort of grow apart. He was also kind of closer to Augusta at one point, the archmage who kind of focuses on divination magic and is more of a sort of soldier than primarily a wizard. But a lot of the archmages had kind of grown more estranged and apart over time. He spends a lot of time interacting with the nobility in his own nation, although increasingly over time it's hard for him to call them friends, as well as the nobility and kind of important people in other countries. Is it's important to him to sort of maintain this diplomatic web of alliances, so he's always writing letters to people around the world. So Pyrrhus also has had several magic projects going on in his life that I don't want to go into too much detail because it's sort of spoilers for things in the world that exist after the apocalypse. But one thing he became obsessed with over time is that ultimately the sort of longevity of the Archmages wasn't permanent. They hadn't discovered immortality. And one of the ways that he sort of thought about extending his own lifespan and producing that would be understanding how to encode the thoughts and nature of a person in words and letters and ink. And so that's something that he spent a decent amount of time working on. And all of the Archmages, in one way or another, were also trying to learn and to deal with each other's powers. And Pyrrhus had a theory, and I don't want to go into too much detail about whether this theory is correct or not, that through enough belief and worship, one might be able to create a god. And in order to challenge Servo's power, he had some thoughts about how that might happen.
So Pyrrhus is kind of highly influential in the overall landscape of Atnia even after the apocalypse, because he was sort of shaping a lot of the kind of magical entities and things within Atnia. And perhaps as people in the post-apocalyptic societies that are kind of disconnected currently, but are sort of slowly branching out from their little areas and being able to travel slightly more safely. Maybe they'll be running into some more of the stuff that Pyrus perhaps had a hand in.
So yeah, definitely. As people start exploring more of the world, there are certain places where the magical laws are more intact. In particular, in some of the cities, the magical laws are still present. And even more so than that, around the world there are books that, again, Pyrrhus has thought about encoding information in language that will sort of, if you read them, they'll just sort of transpose knowledge and ability into people's heads. And this is kind of a contingency plan, as he always thought, even if he were gone, he wanted his perfect sort of nation to persist without him. And in order to do that, there was sort of a class in Atnia of sort of magical lawyers known as arbiters that were able to repair and create the laws of the nation via their magic, officiate over contracts. They were sort of like errant lawyers, I suppose, in a way. And there are books around the world that he basically has seeded to reignite that tradition of arbiters and restore law to Atnia if something terrible were to ever happen.
Yeah, so kind of a broad theme of what is happening in Atnia in the current day is there's a general split between the cultures and societies and structures and forces that are trying to maybe rebuild the old kingdom, and the ones that are sort of trying to create a new path for Atnia. And both of these are obviously containing a bunch of different groups that are going about in wildly different ways, and they might hate each other, but that's kind of a thing that seems to be consistently coming up. Is you have, for example, the Knights of Redemption, which are trying to remake the old society, as well as the Fifth Legion, which we've talked about, and then people like the Salt Alliance, Forsaken, and the Old Watch, who are doing pretty much the opposite in different ways. And then there's these magical arbiters, which are sort of using these magical books that are found in the world, and maybe there's slowly becoming more arbiters over time as more people would like to gain this knowledge. And they're kind of another force that's being thrown into the mix as an institution that is being slowly rebuilt.
Absolutely. It's sort of a core tension of the world and the country of Atnia is how much we want to salvage from the things from the past versus how much we want to sort of move on into the unknown in the future. And while all of these factions kind of differ on it between them, there's variance within the factions, right? The Old Watch sort of has its strong legalistic bent that is in some ways trying to pull that back from the old world, as much as it is also a revolutionary faction that wants to get rid of the concept of nobility, versus the Knights of Redemption are very much a faction that's trying to restore the old world in a lot of ways, but they also exist with this kind of true nobility that didn't exist to the same extent that it does for them prior to the apocalypse. So all factions and kind of everyone in this world is dealing with this tension between the old and the new to make choices about what to keep and what to leave behind. So yeah, that's about it for this lore episode. I'm sure there will be a lot more to learn about Pyrus over time as we sort of reveal some of the more secrets of the world through the various media that we're planning to produce. But I think that's a really solid overview for now. And we'll be doing this for the other Archmages at some point. We just felt like we ought to start with Pyrus, as this is mostly set in Atnia, and so seeing this sort of powerful force that is kind of looming over the history of this nation would be important to understand how things are now.
The political is a fickle thing in all its forms, an instrument of chaos and disunity that good government must rein in. It may be tempting to conclude from this that politics should be avoided in their entirety by the ascension of an absolute ruler, chosen from the best stock a nation has to offer. But this would be folly, for a single misstep by the absolute may be met with resentment and revolution. In the resulting state of anarchy, all would once again become political. An absolute monarch, therefore, must be kept in check by some legitimate avenues of political power held by the masses, a necessary concession to chaos to prevent true calamity. From Essays on Justice by Chancellor Pyrus. Join our Discord server, by the way, if you would like to talk to us about any of the projects that we're working on within Atnia and Project Delta. If you know somebody who is interested in doing software, art, graphic design,
playtesting, anyone who knows anything about publishing this kind of thing in paper, anyone who's interested in coming, chatting about the lore, learning about the world itself, please come.
But yeah, we are looking for people to do the things that we don't know how to do, and we are looking for people who are interested in talking about the project and testing it.